All right, guys. So we just got some breaking news that Derek Chauvin, the officer who is pressing his knee on George Floyd and murdering him in cold daylight, we all saw the video out there, that he has now been put in police custody and he is now being charged with third-degree murder or manslaughter. And so this is a major development in this story. Chris, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's obviously a disgusting video to try to watch and try to sit through, but when you sit down and you look at the some of the smaller details in that video, I mean, murder charges seem appropriate. We had a situation where um, the cops were clearly, or the police officers were not in danger at any time, and no part, people were standing around commenting on it, so there was nothing endangering those police officers. And there's just little bits like the point where he pushes his knee in a little bit harder into George, and it's like, okay, that's only cruelty, right? There's no real reason why he needed to push even harder into that
And
individual's neck.
and
And then oh,
yeah, and he
go ahead.
does it when George cries out, "I can't breathe." Then he leans in harder. I mean, it's
Right.
unbelievable. I mean, the video is so outrageous, completely
And
outrageous.
people are sitting around telling him, "You're going to kill this man." Like, that was the consensus of people around, is this man's going to die. So it wasn't like it wasn't an accidental thing. Like, it was clearly understood. It
Yeah,
was
and
like
and
a
George
logical thing.
and George told him. George says, "I can't
Yeah.
breathe. You're gonna kill me, man." And then he leans in further. I mean, we've talked about this video
Yeah.
on this channel, but I mean, it's completely outrageous, completely disgusting. I mean, I was saying immediately that the charges clearly need to be murder. Now, the interesting thing is we've seen third degree charges, we're seeing manslaughter charges. There's a bit of a debate about this. Some people argue that it makes sense to go with a third degree charge because it's more likely that you're going to be able to get a conviction. Um, I don't. I mean, you look at the video. I think it's clearly second degree. Clearly second degree. I mean, it seems to meet the standards. I mean,
I would think that I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think that you could meet second degree for sure. I mean, everyone seemed to understand what was taking place. I don't buy that it was an accidental death. I mean, the hardest part for me in that video was when this individual, this large, healthy, strong individual, is crying for his mom. He's crying mama at the end because he knows what's happening to him. The police officer must know what's happening. I mean, I've read stuff where police officers are coming out and saying, "We are trained. You don't put pressure on that neck unless it's life and death. You think someone's going for your gun or something like that. You don't mess with the neck if you can at all avoid it." Now, obviously, there's different trainings in these different police forces. Uh, they all take different trainings along the way, but it should be pretty, you would hope it's understood by people in that line of work. Neck injuries can be nasty. I mean, you can obviously be suffocated, but there's neck injuries that you can incur which you end up dying from, hours later, do you in, because you've got all sorts of things can go wrong in the neck. I mean, this just, there's no excuse for this kind of a thing.
yeah, I mean, it definitely does seem to me like it's a clear second degree case, and the idea that, oh well, we only can go for manslaughter seems a little bit ridiculous to me, and I'm not sure that it's going to be enough to slow down the protest, because I mean that's definitely part of why the conviction happened when it did and how it did. I mean, we saw, for instance, the Justice Department moving the George Floyd case to the top of the priority list. They were looking obviously at the protest. They were like, this is really bad. We're moving this thing up. This is number one now. This is the top thing that we
Right.
did, and I mean that obviously influenced influenced this case there. The idea that you couldn't push for second degree, I don't know.
And maybe it was a fear that it's going to all get political, which it already is getting very political. And you're going to have backlash from certain parts of society that, don't. It seems like they're not able to see both sides of the argument and realize, after watching this video, this man was murdered, rather than, so many people are instantly coming up with excuses about why this kind of thing isn't as bad as many of us are making it out to be. I mean, the protests are obviously, when you see buildings being burned, that's obviously not great. But at the same point, you have to, realize, and this is coming from a white male having this point of view, but you have to try to put yourself, what would it be like to grow up in a country where you see people like you being murdered in broad daylight, and then when you do try to bring up the conversation in other forms, it's either dismissed or it's put down. A lot of people are pointing out about Kaepernick taking a knee. Well, he was trying to raise awareness about issues, and it became this big thing where people didn't want to listen, people didn't want to hear. So then the question becomes, well, what is the proper forum for people to bring up issues and be able to change things in a meaningful way? And not that I condone violence or rioting, but you kind of have to you kind of get to understand where the frustration is coming from, where the anger is coming from.
Right. How are people going to vent if you tell them that any way that they vent is un-American? Right. Colin Kaepernick, he's
Right.
taking a knee, like he's literally just taking a knee during a sports game. You didn't even have to put your camera on him. You decided to do
Right.
that. You made the decision to put the camera on him. But
Right.
somehow that's unacceptable. You can't protest in any way. And so it just seems like what do you want, right? You can't be damned if you do, damned if you don't, and then get mad when somebody just says, well, screw it. Like,
Yeah.
what are you trying to do? What are you trying to do? You're getting mad at the protesters, saying that, oh well, there's no point in you breaking things because that's not going to be productive. It's like, well, you didn't ever give them a legitimate avenue to be productive. So how are you going to get mad? How are you going to get mad?
Yeah, and it's not like we're talking about little stuff here. We're talking literally about life and death. People who, go out in public and feel like their life is in danger from the very people that are supposed to be protecting everyone. It's an emotional issue that's going to trigger some deep feelings in people.
Yeah, and part of the stuff that is going on, it's possible that there's some sort of COVID, influences for why these protests are sparking off the way that they are. Not just in Minneapolis, but across the country. We're seeing protests in Ohio. We're seeing protests in Louisville. We're seeing protests in Los Angeles. We're seeing protests basically all across the country. We saw protests in Phoenix. We saw protests in Denver. So they're all across the country right now. Everyone has grievances. But some people are pointing out how, when you talk about the coronavirus, you're talking about millions of people who aren't at work right now. Millions and millions of people who aren't at work. Lots of people lost their jobs. So there's already a kind of natural angst. People haven't been able to go places. They've been inside. And now you give them a legitimate reason to go out, a legitimate reason to go outside. Yeah, they're going to go outside. So some people are also pointing to that as possibly being a bit of an accelerator factor to some of this. Do you think that there's anything to that, or do you think that it's?
I mean, it could be, right? When a person's, already frustrated with the current situation that's going on, we've all been in situations where you're already frustrated, and then, something else kind of pushes you over the edge to pass you past that critical line where something develops.
Right.
But I mean, it's also understandable that this is largely about race, because it's not like this is an isolated incident and this is the only time we've seen something like this. I mean, for years, there's videos popping up of these horrible incidences occurring on a regular basis. And it's kind of like with the gun violence. Like, how many mass shootings do we have to see before we go, maybe there's a problem that needs to be addressed here? And it's the same thing with race. Maybe there's a problem here that needs to be addressed, because we have systemic racism in the system.
I mean, you can't look at the numbers. You can't look at the data. You can't look at this stuff and be like, oh, nothing's going on. You can't watch that video of George Floyd. You can't watch these videos out there. You can't hear these stories and think to yourself, well, nothing's going on. Everything's perfectly fine. I mean, you have to be like a real denialist in some respects to be like that. But there is an interesting, I think, connection possibly between the COVID stuff, where America was kind of a bit of a keg, a bit of a time bomb there, in that something was going to blow somewhere, and then you give people a legitimate reason to go out and protest, and they're going to go. I mean, I think that there definitely would have been massive protest in Minneapolis for that incident regardless, for sure, and probably protests in sister cities across the country, but definitely to see protests popping up in small towns across the country, basically everywhere, I think that does speak a little bit to kind of a national sentiment where everybody's fed up with everything. But there's another really big detail to this story that a lot of people are putting a lot of attention to here, which is that Amy Klobuchar, we're having a debate about this whole thing. Maybe it didn't even need to happen. Amy Klobuchar, top tier VP, possible option for Joe Biden, was involved with this very same officer back when she was a prosecutor and declined to prosecute after he shot a Native American man. So it seems to be an instance where Amy Klobuchar is involved in this thing. Amy Klobuchar could have prevented this thing.
Yeah, and I don't the details haven't been released, and because of the nature of it, we don't know if they're going to be released. So
Right.
we don't know exactly what the issue is with Klobuchar, but this definitely hurts her chances of being chosen as VP. I mean, Biden already has some pretty severe race issues already, and then bringing in someone else who potentially, yeah, could have, maybe it turns out that this could have been prevented, where this person was not on the police force anymore, and then this kind of thing didn't occur in the first place. So
Right. And you know, the statement which she came out, she started saying, "Oh well, you know, if I was a prosecutor now, I would have prosecuted that case back then." But see, prosecutors back then, they didn't do that stuff. They didn't get involved in this kind of police stuff. I'm like, maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's the problem because you weren't willing to prosecute police officers for these kinds of crimes. And so, you know, it just showed me that comment from her just showed me just this complete lack of self-reflection. This thought that, oh
right.
well, she's completely absolved because, oh, that's just not what prosecutors do. She sees herself as doing a job. She doesn't see herself as trying to bring about change. She doesn't see herself as trying to bring about action. I mean, I don't want to sit here and, you know, dissect her entire life out of one quote, but nonetheless, that's a very, very damning quote, if you ask me.
Yeah, none of it looks good. None of it looks good. And if you're trying to put together a ticket that's hopefully going to do, hopefully is going to succeed, you don't really want to have two people on there that seem to be completely clueless when it comes to race issues. Right?
Yeah, I
You
mean,
hope there's some kind of marker there that can lead them in the right direction racially.
yeah, I mean, Joe Biden definitely has had issues, issues with that in the past. We saw, for instance, in the summer debates with, Kamala Harris criticizing Joe Biden on the issue of busing, which, you know, a lot of people, thought that was a, very legitimate criticism. And even people who voted for Joe Biden do concede that that's a legitimate, a very legitimate concern. Now, there's another major facet to this whole thing, which is Twitter. When you start talking about these protests here, which is that Twitter is starting to censor Donald Trump a little bit. So we saw this a couple days ago where Twitter came out and fact-checked Donald Trump on the issue of mail-in voting, mail-in ballots. Well, this morning we saw another tweet from the president coming out where he's talking about when the looting begins, the shooting begins, which is a bit of a racial dog whistle. It's a reference to an old police chief back in the 1960s and some of the Miami riots in, I think, 1967. I know it was the 1960s. And so it's an interesting situation there where he's referencing a literal like racist police officer. And so anyway, Twitter basically censored Donald Trump, saying that I'm going to just sort of quote the tweet that Twitter, or the, I guess, message that Twitter has over the tweet now. It says, "This tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter is determined that it may be in the public's best interest for the tweet to remain accessible." So it's an interesting situation where both times, for instance, with the fact check and the instance of here where saying that the tweet violated the rules, where they're not actually deleting the tweet, not actually changing the tweet, they're just putting a bit of a flag over it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so the Twitter situation is so weird, and especially the way Trump is involved, because obviously I don't know Trump personally, but from what I've seen of him in the last few years, it seems like you can put together this model of who Donald Trump is, where he's just not used to being told no. I mean, his whole life, he's been in a position where he can surround himself with yes men who just say, oh, yep, whatever you want, that's what I'm going to do. I mean, that's what he's done in the government. He's taken out the people, inspectors general, and the people running these different agencies. He takes out the ones who might actually act on their own, and he puts in, toadies that are just going to be yes men and say whatever he wants. And Twitter is obviously so important to him that I think it just cuts so deep when Twitter has finally said, okay, this has gone too far. We have to start calling out some of the stuff that's major. I mean, one of the biggest problems in our society right now is the issue of voting and fair voting. And does everyone get to vote, and votes getting counted? So I'm all for them pointing out, okay, these are the actual facts. So they're, like you said, they're not deleting the tweet. They're saying, here's some additional facts
Right.
that go with it. And then the thing that he did last night or this morning, I mean, I wasn't even aware that that was a racial callback. Even just on the face of it, it's a horrible thing to say. That you're basically, it's kind of that hint that, okay, it's okay if violence starts happening, because as long as you're on Team Trump, it's okay if you
Right.
take violence into your own hands.
I mean, it's definitely a super, super crazy situation to see a tweet like that. I mean, it's also talking about bringing in the military, saying that the military stands with Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, and then he's saying when the looting begins, or when the looting starts, the shooting begins. I mean, it's definitely a weird quote, also, because there was a bit of a debate initially before people sort of, uh, you know, started bringing in the kind of racial angle there, which is there's a bit of a debate whether or not he was saying when the looters start looting, then they start shooting, or whether or not he was saying when the looters start, then we're going to start shooting at them. And so, there was a weird debate there. It's just a weird tweet overall, I think.
Yeah, I guess the way I interpret it is definitely as a threat, because I mean, I haven't seen, unless I've missed it, the cases where the looters themselves are actually shooting people, right? It seems like the I definitely interpreted it as, we're going to have to put things down when the looting continues.
Right. I mean, my thought though, when I was looking at that initial debate, I was, it was like 4 a.m. or whatever. I was like, well, isn't it kind of both? Because if he's saying that he's bringing in the military and these so-called looters out there, what he's calling looters, um, you can argue that that's probably a racialized term in and of itself. That these people are, stealing stuff, so then we need to bring in the military and shoot them, or he's saying, like, so it seems like he's kind of saying both in a sense. I don't know. That was kind of my interpretation, my take on some of it. Now it is interesting how they're not how they're not like blocking the tweet so that you can't view it, right? Because that was one of the big, I guess, sort of arguments when it came to whether or not Twitter, whether or not Facebook was going to be censoring in the first place, right? Because it was like, well, if
Hmm.
we just block the tweet, then that in itself could be corrupting to democracy, sort of, in that people can't then make up their own mind. They can't look at Donald Trump and be like, why is this
Yeah.
guy saying that? Because all the tweets got deleted, and so they might not think that the tweets were bad, right? So that was one of the arguments that some people were making, that actually it's counterproductive for the social media sites to block Donald Trump's tweets anyway. And so it seems like the solution that Twitter came to was just to leave a little tag, a little flag over it. But there's an argument to be had there, is that really doing anything besides making people who like Donald Trump upset because they see him getting flagged by a big social media company? I don't know.
Yeah, I always like the idea of adding more information to the conversation. So if you can take a weird situation and inject some truth into it, I always feel like that's the way to go. But that's kind of how I'm used to doing these. You sit down, you research it, and then like on YouTube, you go make a video about it or whatever. But you got to do sort of the fact finding part before you do that. So I kind of agree with the way they do this. I actually don't think that any of his tweets should be completely censored, because I think it's in the best interest of all of us to know exactly what is in Trump's mind. And if he wants to share that with us through Twitter or whatever, that lets us understand what he's thinking, what he's planning to do, where he's coming from. And then we can make our minds up about that and go, well, this is completely bananas. We got to make sure this guy's not president again for another 4
Yeah,
years.
I mean, I definitely am on board with adding a little note there where you can look up information about a particular tweet. I actually would be in favor of something like that almost universally. Like, you're tweeting about a specific issue and you can have like a little sort of fact page pop up.
Yeah.
It would have to be smaller than the little flag that they gave to Donald Trump, but just like a little information flag that comes with tweets. I don't think that would be a bad idea at all. I think that would be pretty productive. Um, but in this most recent case here, where they literally just put a little flag over top of it saying this tweet violated Twitter rules, I don't
Hmm.
know. Like I'm not sure that really does anything besides upset people who don't like Donald Trump, or people who do like Donald Trump, and then people who don't like Donald Trump, like, oh yeah, go Twitter, like, wow, really give it to him. But I don't know. I'm not sure that really does anything. I don't know. I'm on the fence
Yeah,
maybe.
the flag this morning, you kind of wonder if it was just sort of gamesmanship because they Twitter now seems to have entered this competition with Trump that could play out in courts at some point, or but there's public opinion. So this may have been motivated somewhat. I don't know. Obviously, I'm not at Twitter, but it may have been motivated a little bit by trying to manage how this whole thing's going to play out. Because I seriously
Mm.
doubt that we're out of this whole Twitter controversy because Trump's going to keep tweeting, and then Twitter is probably going to keep moderating those
Right.
tweets
I
in
mean, they
some
can't.
manner or another.
I mean, at this point, I mean, clearly, like, considering how many years it took them to start doing this, they've been talking about this, right? They've been having this
Yeah.
conversation and they made a decision, right? They made a decision, you know what? We're not going to put up with this. We're not going to let our
Right.
reputation be, this in the long run because one day Donald Trump won't be here, right? So, like, they made a decision. And at this point, once Donald Trump turns around saying that he's signing an executive order that it's not clear whether or not it's enforceable, right? It seems clear that they've made a decision and they can't really back down. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's going to start a chain of events that plays out on a bunch of these platforms between Facebook and Twitter and all of them, where they're trying to feel out what is the correct way to censor things. Where like you have Facebook, who essentially is hands off, like, well, we don't want to get involved because this is the current situation. Facebook seems to like that. It seems like it's making them a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a weird situation. It's actually kind of annoying situation, I should say, where by not getting in, you've actually actively taken a side, right? They're like, "Oh, we're not taking a
Yeah,
side," but by not taking a side, they've
right.
actually taken a side, which is definitely something that happens a lot for sure in politics, and it's definitely I think interesting how this most recent event here when it comes to George Floyd has really popped it off in that regard where Donald Trump, yeah, he's literally actively violating Twitter rules. I mean, yeah, you can't mostly like more or less threaten to start shooting people, right? You can't do
Yeah,
stuff like that. That's clearly not acceptable. But then there's the thought that like, oh, but he's a world leader, right? So that's it.
right.
It does kind of, it definitely. A lot of people have debates there. A lot of people have debates there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, anyway, thank you, Chris, for joining us for this conversation, chatting about all this. I'll leave your information down in the description. If any of you guys want to check out Chris's channel, you can. It's Political Perspective. All right, Chris, thanks for joining us.